The next four topics are going to cover how we take in nourishment, how that nourishment is absorbed, and then what happens to those nutritive molecules when they get to your cells. So we're going to start with just an overview of the anatomy of the digestive system, then look at the accessory organs of the digestive system, things like the pancreas and the liver that produce enzymes and other compounds that help us break down our food. Then we'll talk about how nutrition is absorbed into our bloodstream, and then we'll talk about cellular respiration, which is where those molecules are going to be broken down to release energy in every single cell in your body. So what does the digestive system do? Well, it has to do quite a few things. The first step is ingestion. Ingestion is physically taking in food and liquid. So of course you're going to drink substances, you're going to eat substances, and that's the act of ingestion. The second part is secretion. So your digestive system has to secrete mucus that will serve as kind of a lubricating substance and a protective substance. It has to produce buffers that will help maintain the pH. It has to produce acids. It has to produce enzymes that will catalyze the reactions that are required to digest food. So secretion is done by cells that are lining the digestive system itself, and also by cells that are found in accessory organs, organs that are attached to the digestive system. Then we have mixing and propulsion. So the food, hopefully, is only going to flow in one direction. It's going to go from your mouth to your anus. And this propulsion, this movement of material, is accomplished mostly by smooth muscle. There's some skeletal muscle involved as well. So you have some control over what happens in the beginning in your mouth and in the upper portion of your throat. You have some control over what happens at the other end. So there is an external sphincter of the anus that you have control over, that you can open and close. However, for the rest of the digestive system, you really don't have any control. There's involuntary smooth muscle that is going to move food along by a process known as peristalsis, and also mix the food. So the food has to be churned in the stomach, for instance. The food needs to be mixed with enzymes and buffers and other things. Then we have actual digestion, and what I'm referring to here is breaking down food into smaller particles and breaking down large molecules into smaller molecules. So the mechanical aspect of this is physically breaking food into smaller pieces, and that's what happens in the mouth, for instance. You chew food, you mash it up, you break it into smaller pieces, and that provides more surface area for chemical reactions to work on. So we can break things down more readily if we increase the surface area of those chunks of food. And then chemical digestion refers to the chemical reactions that take things like proteins, for instance, and break them into their subunits. So amino acids in that example. So we're taking large molecules, breaking them down into smaller bits so that those small bits can be absorbed. Absorption is going to occur mainly in the small intestine, although a lot of water is absorbed in the large intestine. We'll talk about that. Here we have to absorb things like amino acids into the bloodstream so that they can be carried to all of the cells throughout your body. And finally, defecation. So anything that can't be absorbed, roughage, fiber, needs to pass through and be removed by the body. And also, you have a lot of bacteria living in your digestive tract that live out their lives there. Actually, it's quite fascinating. There are far more bacteria cells in your body than there are human cells. But anyway, those bacteria live out their lifespan in your digestive system. They die, they need to be passed, and quite a large portion of your feces actually consist of dead bacteria and also dead blood cells as well. So your red blood cells get worn out, they die, they're dumped into your digestive tract. Let's start at the beginning by looking at the development of the digestive system, also known as the alimentary canal. If you think about it, the digestive system is simply a tube. It's a tube that runs from your mouth to your anus. And really, you consist of a tube within a tube. So you have this digestive system within a meat tube, which is the rest of you. We start out as zygotes. So a zygote is a single cell. It's the cell that resulted from fertilization. So your father's sperm, your mother's egg came together, produced a zygote. The zygote divided into 2 cells. Those 2 cells divided into 4. Those 4 divided into 8, etc. At the 8-celled stage, you are just a solid ball of cells, and the cells keep dividing, and as they do, they get smaller and smaller. There's not much growth of cells at this point. Eventually, we end up with a hollow ball of cells. So we have this single layer of cells, and then we have this cavity in the middle. And that entire structure is known as a blastula. Now, the next thing that happens, and you can see this down the bottom here as well, is one side gets pushed in. So imagine you have something like a tennis ball, and you take your finger and you poke in one side and you make this internal pouch. At this point, the cells that are still on the outside are referred to as ectoderm cells, and the cells that have been pushed in, shown in yellow here, are referred to as endoderm cells. The endoderm is going to give rise to the digestive tract, the lining of the digestive tract, and also the lining of the accessory organs that connect to the digestive tract. The ectoderm is going to give rise to the skin and also to the nervous system as well. So at this point, the gastrula consists of this ball of cells with one opening, and that opening is known as the blastopore. A second opening forms. So what's going to happen is we're going to have an opening forming here as well, which you can see in the next diagram. So now we have this tube within this sphere. The very first opening that forms, the blastopore, at the bottom of the gastrula there in the second diagram, that opening becomes the anus. And later on, that second opening that forms becomes the mouth. So in this third diagram here, we have this flow-through tube. The top is the mouth, and the bottom is the anus. The next thing that happens is we have a third layer that forms called the mesoderm. And this forms as kind of a pocket of solid tissue within the cavity of the blastula. And then it forms a cavity inside itself. So those blocks of tissue develop a cavity. That cavity is something known as the coelom. That develops into body cavities. So your ventral body cavity, for instance. And we'll come back to that. So if that didn't make sense just yet, it's okay. We're going to come back to that. But one thing to note is in the very early embryo, you have 3 what are called germ layers that give rise to everything that's going to develop in your body. So you have the ectoderm, shown in blue, you have the endoderm, shown in yellow, and you have the mesoderm, shown in red. The mesoderm is going to give rise to muscles, to the skeleton, and to other connective tissue. Again, the digestive system starts out as a simple tube. In fact, some biologists like to refer to this tube as their inner worm. But that tube is going to expand in some areas. It's going to be thrown into loops. It's going to get far more complicated as you develop. So you can see in that first diagram there, diagram A, this is at 6 weeks. And in the 6-week-old embryo, we have a simple tube, but it's been formed into a loop already. And the red is showing blood vessels that develop within that loop. There's a membrane that develops within that loop. And this is going to give rise to some of the important membranes that help support the intestines and also contain all the blood vessels that are taking nourishment from the intestines and supplying the intestines themselves with blood flow. Notice that at part B here, we're just beginning to see a little swelling in this tube, and that swelling is going to become the stomach. And really, the stomach is just a part of that tube that has ballooned up a bit. Now you can see later on, at 12 weeks gestation there, we have something that is recognizable as a digestive system. It's not fully formed just yet, but at this point we have some new loops and folds, and we've even got a large intestine or colon that has formed. But again, the take-home message here is it's just a tube, and that tube twists itself, expands in places to give rise to the entire digestive system. In figure B, you're seeing an early human embryo in a side view. So you're seeing a lateral view. And the yellow is the developing digestive system. Up here is an area known as the pharynx, and that's going to develop into your throat, basically. There's a lot going on in your throat. At this stage of development, there's pouches there called pharyngeal pouches, and there's also slits. If you think of a shark, for instance, you know that they have slits along their throat and they pass water out through those slits. Well, all vertebrate embryos have those slits early in development. We lose them. The other diagrams at the top there, A and C, are showing you sections through this early embryo. The yellow in those sections is endoderm, and that's the innermost lining of the digestive tract. So that's going to line the lumen or space within the digestive tract. The red is mesoderm. It's giving rise to muscle, but it's also giving rise to the tissues that line the inside of the coelom. Coelom, C-O-E-L-O-M, that is the body cavity. So we have, as adults, of course, we have a thoracic cavity that's divided into pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity. We have the abdominopelvic cavity. Those are all lined by cells that originated as mesoderm. Down the bottom there, the bottom set of figures shows you the development of mesenteries. And mesenteries are membranes that support the digestive system. So they support the folds of the intestines, and they also attach the digestive organs to the back of the coelom, to the back of the body cavity. We'll come back to that in more detail, and you'll look at that in lab in more detail as well. The mesenteries also contain a lot of blood vessels. So of course, we need lots of blood flow to the digestive organs, not just to feed those organs, but also to extract nutrients that's going to feed the entire body. So here is your inner tube. And once again, it is just a simple tube that expands in some places. Now, what also happens to this tube as it develops is that little pockets bud off of it. And those little pockets give rise to the interior of the accessory digestive organs. So things like the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas and so on that contribute enzymes and other things to the digestive system start as just little pockets, little blind sacs that form off of the digestive tract. The digestive tract also shares some real estate with the respiratory system. So the pharynx, the throat, is really important in that that's the area where air and food have to be separated. And if you look at the diagram of the embryo here, we have the pharynx, and then we have something called this respiratory diverticulum. I'm not going to have you memorize diverticulum, but a diverticulum is a blind sac, basically. And what I mean by blind sac is it's a sac with an opening, but the sac doesn't go anywhere, at least not yet. So it's this blind sac that will develop into the lungs. You can see in this embryo we also have the heart here at a very simple stage. The heart starts out as a tube as well. So your circulatory system begins as a tube, and the heart develops as a swelling on that tube, and then it twists itself around to form the different chambers of the heart. Notice that we've got this bud down here, the liver bud, another diverticulum, which is going to give rise to interior parts of the liver. So once again, the endoderm is going to line the entire digestive tract, and it's going to line the tubes and the pockets that form the interior of the accessory organs. In this embryo, I'll also mention that at this point in time, you can see the embryo has a tail. We have a fairly pronounced tail during our early development. There's also an opening known as the cloaca. So at this point in development, all of the developing systems that need to exit the bottom of the body, so the reproductive system, the digestive system, the urinary system, they all exit into one hole. Cloaca is Latin for sewer. And if you look at a lot of other vertebrates, reptiles, birds, fish, they all still have a cloaca. They have this one single opening. But of course, as we develop and as other mammals develop, those openings separate out, which is nice. It would be, I think, maybe a bit gross to have a cloaca. Okay, so just to summarize the developmental stuff, at a very early stage of development, we consist of just a hollow ball of cells, and that's known as the blastula. At that point in time, the cells don't have their fate decided. They could develop into any number of tissues. But the next step is gastrulation, and that's where one side of the ball gets pushed in to form a pouch. The cells that get pushed in form a layer called the endodermis, while the cells that stay behind form a layer called the ectoderm. And at this point, the cells do have their fates decided somewhat. So the endoderm cells are going to give rise to the innermost lining of the digestive organs, and also the digestive accessory organs, which, if you recall, are organs that form as little pockets that come off of the digestive system. The ectoderm, the outer layer, as I mentioned, also has its fate decided. It's going to develop into skin and the nervous system. The innermost layer of the digestive system is known as mucosa, or a mucous membrane. So this is going to line the cavities or lumen of the internal organs. Keep in mind that the cells that line the interior of the digestive tract are continuous with cells that are on the outside of the body. So in the mouth, we have mucosa inside the mouth, and those cells are going to abut against the cells that make up the lips and the skin of the face. Now, those cells that make up the skin are derived from ectoderm. So these cells are a continuous layer, but they come from different places. They have different origins. And the same thing happens at the other end of the body as well. These epithelial layers can consist of more than one layer of cells. So if you remember back to BIOL 111, we can have simple epithelial layers where there's just one layer of cells, but we can have stratified epithelial layers where there's several layers of cells. But in all cases, epithelial layers have a basement membrane. This is a membrane made up of collagen and other connective fibers that they attach to. And then the other end of that layer or layers is exposed to an open space, to the lumen of an organ in this case. Most mucosa layers are going to produce mucus. That's kind of where they get their name from. And mucus is going to form a protective layer that is going to help prevent infection. Bacteria have to burrow through this layer of mucus, which gives them some problems. It's also going to prevent dehydration, and in some cases it might protect the underlying cells from extremely acidic conditions in the stomach, for instance. Let's take a look at a typical section through a digestive organ. What we're looking at here is a section through the wall of the duodenum, or if you want to use the, I think, more fun British pronunciation, the duodenum. The duodenum or duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. At the top, we've got the mucosa. This is epithelial tissue. It developed from endoderm, and it's exposed to the lumen, which is the space within the intestine. So that's the cavity within the intestine. Underneath that, we've got the submucosa, which is connective tissue. And underneath that, we've got the muscularis, which, as the name suggests, is muscle. It's made of smooth muscle. This is involuntary muscle that you don't have any control over. Both the submucosa and the muscularis are derived from mesoderm. What we've got here is a pretty typical section of a digestive organ. You're looking at the duodenum, or duodenum, if you want to use the British pronunciation. And this shows us all the layers that we've touched on already, the mucosa, the submucosa, and the muscularis. We see those regions or layers within all the digestive organs. However, they're represented differently. So for instance, the submucosa might be thicker or thinner depending on what organ we're talking about. The muscularis can be quite thick, or it can be a very thin layer. Okay, so let's take a look at the duodenum here, and we'll start in the center. So in the center of the intestine, you have a space that's known as the lumen, and then surrounding that you have epithelium. And the epithelial layer can be stratified or simple, so it can consist of a few layers of cells or just a single layer. At the bottom of that epithelium, you've got something called the basement membrane. That's what the cells attach to, and that anchors the cells. Below that, we've got something called the lamina propria, and this connects to the basement membrane. It's connective tissue that just kind of holds things together. Below that, we've got a thin layer of involuntary muscle you have no control over, called the muscularis mucosae. This isn't responsible for peristalsis. It's not responsible for moving food, but what it does is it kind of wiggles around and it causes the villi, we'll talk about those in a moment, those are projections from the epidermis. It causes those to kind of wave around, and it just makes sure that the surface area of the epithelium is in constant motion so that it can make direct contact with the contents of the lumen. So the purpose of that layer is just to make sure that the epithelium is constantly coated in fresh material. Okay, so below the mucosa, we have the submucosa. And once again, that's connective tissue, and you can see that there's some veins and arteries in it as well. We have veins and arteries that will supply the tissues with nourishment while at the same time taking away waste. But also, of course, we have veins, the hepatic portal system, we'll get to later, that is going to collect the nutrients that the intestine and the stomach and so on are absorbing, and it's going to carry that material back to the liver. The liver will process those nutrients and also break down any toxins before that blood gets dumped into general circulation. Notice that we also have a network of nerves that are found within the submucosa, and also they innervate the muscularis that I'll get to in a second. These nerves, this network of nerves, serves as almost a digestive brain. So the digestive system can regulate movements of material without involving the brain in many cases, and that's done in part through this network of nerves. Below the submucosa, we have the muscularis. This is a much thicker layer of muscle than the muscularis mucosae. The muscularis is responsible for peristalsis. It's responsible for waves of contraction that move material down the length of the digestive system. And again, this is involuntary muscle. You don't have any control over it. Outside of that, we have a layer called the serosa. And this region forms the outer part of the intestine or stomach, and the surface is quite slippery. So it generates a fluid called serous fluid that lubricates the outside of the digestive organs so that they don't stick together and they can slide past each other as you move around. Let's take a look at each of these broad layers in a bit more detail. So starting again from the inside, we have the epithelium. And if you remember from Biology 111, epithelium consists of cells that are exposed to a space or the outside environment on one end. That's the apical surface of the epithelium, and then at the base they're attached to something called the basement membrane, which is a layer of non-cellular material. It's a layer of usually mostly collagen and other connective fibers. And the epithelium can consist of one layer of cells or several layers of cells. Also, if you remember back to last term, epithelial cells come in a few different shapes and sizes. If you don't remember that, go back and review that material. The epithelium changes as we go down the length of the digestive tract. So starting in the mouth and also in the pharynx and the esophagus, there are lots of frictional forces, lots of shear stress forces. Think about it. You're chewing stuff up, you're swallowing it, there's sharp little bits, there's potential to damage that epithelium. So the epithelium in the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus, and also in the anal canal, consists of squamous cells. Squamous cells are flattened cells that are quite resistant to frictional forces. Within the stomach and the intestines, the epithelium is columnar. So we have these kind of long pillar-like cells that are standing end to end, and they are specialized with secretion and absorption. So the main function of the small intestine is to absorb nutrients, but within the stomach and within the intestine, we also have some secretion of materials and enzymes and so on. Also note that the cells of the intestine and stomach are held together with tight junctions. Tight junctions are basically like stitching almost that holds the cells together so that fluids can't seep between the cells. So anything that goes from the lumen of the intestine into the blood has to go through a cell, and the cell can control whether or not certain substances get in. So the cells have control over what leaves the lumen and gets into the blood. If we didn't have those tight junctions, fluid could just seep between the cells, seep through the loose connective tissue and get into the bloodstream. We have exocrine glands as well, and these are extensions of the epithelial layer. The glands can be quite large in some cases. They can go deeper as well, so some of these glands can extend into the submucosal layer, or these glands can consist of a single cell. So goblet cells are cells that produce the majority of the mucus that's found within your digestive system, and those are just single cells that make up part of the epithelium. Anything that gets through the epithelial layer passes through those cells, then has to pass through the basement membrane and the lamina propria. Those layers are not selective. So anything that gets through the cell is going to make its way through this loose connective tissue. Within this loose connective tissue, we have something known as mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues, or MALT. These consist of nodules of lymphatic tissue that will collect fluid and destroy any bacteria that might be present. So this MALT is associated with the immune system, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll talk about that in Biology 105 as well, in microbiology. But as you can imagine, there's lots of bacteria in your intestines, and your body wants to make sure that that bacteria is not free to simply roam wherever it wants to. So these little nodes hopefully will scrounge up all that bacteria, destroy it, so that it doesn't get into the bloodstream. The next layer below the lamina propria is the muscularis mucosae. And you can see on this photograph here, it's actually very thin. It consists of a few layers of smooth muscle. Again, you don't have control over smooth muscle. And once again, I mentioned this before, but it's not involved in peristalsis. What it does is it just causes the epithelium to kind of wave around a bit. And that makes sure that fluids, that your half-digested food and so on, can get into these little folds and make contact with all of the epithelial cells so that absorption can occur. The submucosa consists of areolar connective tissue. That's loose connective tissue. Again, it's non-selective. Anything that gets that far is going to seep towards the blood and probably get into the bloodstream. So within that connective tissue, We also have a lot of blood vessels. We have lymphatic tissues as well, and lymph vessels that will collect fluid. We also have the submucosal plexus. So the submucosal plexus is that network of nerves that helps control movements within the stomach. We have glands that originate within the submucosa and extend all the way via ducts to the surface of the epithelium. So we've had a look at the mucosa and submucosa. Let's move on to the muscularis. The muscularis layer is responsible for the movement of material through the digestive system. And it varies quite a bit in thickness depending on what part of the digestive system we're talking about. So in the stomach it is very thick. That's where it gets to its thickest extent. You cannot control most of the stuff that's going on within the middle of your digestive system. So you don't have control over movement of material in the stomach or through the intestines. And that's because the muscularis layer is entirely visceral or smooth, involuntary muscle in that part of the digestive system. But you can control what's happening at the ends of your digestive tube. You can control what's happening in your mouth and in your throat and the upper portion of the esophagus. You can control, at least to some extent, when material is going to leave your digestive system. So you have control at the anus as well. But again, everything in between, you don't have control over. So let's take a look at these three regions that I've got here. And these regions are set up based on what sort of muscles are present and how much control you have. So again, in the mouth, the pharynx, which is the throat, and the upper esophagus, skeletal muscle is present. And you have control over skeletal muscle. A lot of stuff goes on when you're swallowing. The larynx has to move, the glottis has to be closed over by the epiglottis. We'll get into that stuff in a moment, but there's lots of muscle contractions that have to occur in the mouth and pharynx for swallowing to occur properly. And you don't have to think about all those individual muscles, but you do have control over when that happens. At the anus, there are two sphincters, and a sphincter is a ring of muscle. There's one that's an internal sphincter that you can't control, and there's another sphincter, an external sphincter, that you can control. So you have partial control over what happens at the anus. Typically, the internal sphincter is closed. Again, that's the one you don't have control over, and that's going to stop you from, well, pooping the bed, for instance. When you really have to defecate, that sphincter opens up. And when you're running to the bathroom and trying to get there in time, you're relying entirely on the external sphincter, the one that you can clench. And once again, most of the system, though, consists of smooth muscle that's involved in peristalsis, which is waves of contractions that move things along. So the last broad layer to look at would be the serosa. Most of the serosa is areolar connective tissue, so it's loose connective tissue. However, the outermost layer, the layer that makes contact with the body cavity, is epithelium. So remember, epithelium is found lining cavities, or it's also found on the skin. I mean, the epidermis is an epithelial layer as well, but the thing that defines epithelium is it's free at one end, so the top of the cells are exposed to a space. The epithelial layer is going to produce this serous fluid that will keep things slippery. The epithelium layer of the serosa is squamous, so it consists of flattened cells that kind of fit together like jigsaw piece puzzles. And again, that's because there's some friction as your organs slide past each other. It's important to note that we only have serosa in organs that are exposed to the abdominopelvic cavity. So for instance, in the throat, the upper part of the esophagus is surrounded by muscle and connective tissue. There is no serosa there because it's not free to move around in a cavity. We don't need it to be slippery and lubricated. Within the abdominal pelvic cavity, the serosa is going to form what's known as the visceral peritoneum. The peritoneum is the layer of serosa that lines the inside of the cavity and the outside of the organs. So this slippery membrane is continuous with the layer inside the body wall, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a bit. The enteric nervous system is this separate kind of web of nerves that innervate the different organs of the digestive system. And this system can control what's happening in the entire digestive system without involving the brain. So the brain can override this system, but the system can make its own sort of decisions, I use that word loosely, based on what's going on. So let's say that you eat a large meal, and that meal, of course, is going to go down the esophagus and into the stomach. Once it gets to the stomach, a few things are going to happen. There's chemoreceptors that will sense changes in the chemistry of the lumen. So let's say you eat something quite alkaline. Your stomach is going to know to secrete excess acid to bring the pH of the stomach back down below 2. There are mechanoreceptors within the stomach. So you feel full because your stomach stretches. The stomach stretches. There are stretch receptors within the wall of the stomach. That message is sent to your brain, and that tells you you're full, but it's also sent through this enteric system, and it gets the intestine, the small intestine, ready. It basically tells the small intestine to start producing enzymes. There's food on the way. Osmoreceptors basically look at the water balance of the lumen as well. So they determine whether water needs to be extracted, for instance, in the colon. In the colon, you have to remove water so that you can form stool or feces. And if that doesn't happen, of course, diarrhea is the result of that. I should also mention, actually, there is a limit to how much your stomach can hold, and that varies person to person. But you've probably heard and maybe seen those milk challenges where someone will try to drink 4 liters of milk. The problem with that isn't really the milk itself, it's that that is just above the maximum volume for most people. And when the stomach expands that far, the stomach sends a signal to the rest of the body that this might be a dangerous condition, this might cause damage, let's get rid of this. And that's when vomiting occurs. So it's a response to the volume of material that you've taken in, and of course that elicits a whole bunch of responses. Basically peristalsis in reverse. So instead of peristalsis to allow you to swallow something, the peristalsis is going to bring that material back up. The brain can override some of what's happening in the gut. That's this brain-gut axis. So this kind of division between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the gut's brain. If you are emotional, if you are, emotional responses can make us hungry sometimes. We eat out of boredom and for other reasons. If you smell food, taste food, that causes you to salivate. It also, again, readies your digestive system. There's signals sent to your digestive organs telling them to prepare for the arrival of food. So most of these responses are responses you're not aware of, and they don't just involve the nerves, they also involve hormones as well. We'll talk about that later, but your enteric system, your digestive system, can also produce hormones, and the hormones are hormones that stimulate the release of enzymes and so on. And they can also stimulate the movement of smooth muscle to move things along. Let's take a look at body cavities. We have 2 broad cavities. We have a ventral cavity, which is made up of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, and other cavities that are found within those cavities. And then we have what's sometimes called the dorsal body cavity, which is the cranial cavity that contains the brain and the vertebral cavity that contains the spinal cord. Now, the ventral cavity forms from mesoderm. We talked about that briefly before. Remember that you have ectoderm and endoderm, and then you have this massive mesoderm. Meso means middle. It forms between the two, and it becomes hollow in places and gives rise to body cavities. The membrane that lines these cavities is serous membrane. It produces a slippery fluid so that things like the intestines and the heart and the lungs can move around. All right, so we've got the ventral body cavity. That's everything shown in red here, and that can be divided up further. So first of all, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Now, just note that there isn't a membrane that separates the two. Basically, the pelvic cavity is what's surrounded by the bones of the pelvis. Above the abdominal cavity, we have the thoracic or thoracic cavity, and there's a clear definition here. So the diaphragm separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal and abdominal pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is further divided into three cavities. We have two pleural cavities, one containing each lung, and then we have the pericardial cavity in the middle that contains the heart. So we have membranes that separate these cavities. Now the mediastinum, which is at the top of this thoracic cavity, isn't actually a cavity. There's a mass of tissue in there. There's the thymus gland. There is the, a whole lot of arteries and veins coming off the heart. There's other material and loose connective tissue in there as well, but it is a fairly solid structure. It's not part of the other cavities that surround it. Let's discuss the peritoneal cavity. And this can be confusing for some students, so make sure this makes sense to you. If I'm discussing the abdominal pelvic cavity, I'm talking about that portion of the ventral cavity and also everything within it, all the organs within it. If I'm discussing the peritoneal cavity, I'm only talking about the actual space. So the space between the bits of the intestine, the space between the organs, and the body wall. So that's what's shown in red here. That is the peritoneal cavity. And the peritoneal cavity is lined by serous membrane, which altogether makes up a layer known as the peritoneum. We have two parts to the peritoneum. We have the visceral peritoneum, which is the outer serous layer of the organs and also of the membranes, the mesentery, for instance, that support the organs. The parietal peritoneum is the serous membrane that lines the inside of the body cavity. So it's found in association with the body wall. And the two layers are continuous. So here I've just zoomed in on the same mid-sagittal section that you just saw, so you can see these layers a bit more clearly. Once again, the visceral peritoneum is the serous layer, the outermost layer that surrounds organs and the membranes that support them. The parietal peritoneum is the lining of the cavity. It is the innermost layer of the body wall. And the peritoneal cavity is the space in between these membranes. Both the parietal and visceral peritoneum have the same structure, so they have the same anatomy, they have the same function. What they do is they produce serous fluid that helps keep things slippery so that stuff can move around. Now I'll just point this out because I often see students get these confused on tests. Don't get the peritoneum mixed up with the perineum. The perineum is the region on the outside of the body between the anus and the genitals. So they taint the same. And that was a horrible joke, and I apologize. Let's move on. There are a number of folds of the peritoneum that form membranes that help support organs or form kind of coverings that help keep things in place. One of the most obvious is known as the greater omentum. You're seeing it from the front, from the anterior view on the right there. And basically what it is just a bag. It's kind of like a plastic garbage bag, and it's about that size too. So it's a sac. It's made up of 2 layers of peritoneum, and inside that sac, quite often people will store fat. If you're very, very thin, you might have very little fat. People that have kind of a beer belly, where the actual abdomen is extended, it's due to fat storage in that sac below the skin, and it pushes the body wall out. So you can see it on the left from the side, so we're seeing it again in mid-sagittal section, and you can see it is actually a sac. It attaches to the stomach. So at the top here, this is the stomach, the liver is above that, and you can also see that it attaches to the duodenum as well. The next fold we're going to look at is something called the falciform ligament, and this originates on the liver, and it's quite unusual in that it attaches the liver to the anterior body wall. So the greater omentum just hangs like a curtain over top of the intestines. It doesn't attach to them anywhere, and what it does is it serves as kind of a buffer. It's a curtain over the intestines that help hold things in place, so it has a protective role. The falciform ligament attaches the liver to the anterior body wall. And again, that's unusual because all of the other folds that we're going to look at in a moment are used to attach organs to the back of the body cavity. But this attaches to the front. And the liver is a big organ. It's the largest internal organ, and it is quite heavy, so it does need some extra support. The lesser omentum is again a membrane, a parietal fold, that is found under the greater omentum. It's quite small. It just attaches the stomach and the duodenum to the liver. So it basically suspends the stomach and duodenum below the liver. It contains a few important things that we'll talk about later. It contains the hepatic portal vein, which is the vein that collects nutrient-rich blood from the digestive system and takes it to the liver. It contains the hepatic artery, which is an artery that feeds the liver, and it contains the bile duct coming off of the gallbladder. In the diagram on the right, the green object there is the gallbladder. One of the most important of the folds is the mesentery. Mesentery is found between the loops of the intestine, so it kind of holds those loops together, and it attaches to the inside of the posterior abdominal wall. Incidentally, the jejunum is the first portion of the small intestine after the duodenum, and the ileum is the last portion of the small intestine before it connects to the colon. But this is a very important membrane because it does hold things in place, not rigidly. Things can move around a lot, but we'll see this when you dissect a pig, if you have a chance to do that. Within the mesentery, we have lots of blood vessels. So you'll see that it's very well vascularized, and that's because this is where most of the absorption of nutrients is occurring. So we have this really robust system of vessels that are carrying nutrient-rich blood from the intestine. It also stores fat. There's also lymph nodes in there as well, and the lymph nodes can be pretty obvious actually when you're doing a dissection. The colon has its own fold. It has its own membrane for support, which makes sense because the colon or large intestine is pretty big and it can be rather heavy when it's full. We have what's called the mesocolon, which will help support the configuration of the colon. So it's got an ascending part, a transverse part, and a descending part, and hold the entire colon to the back body wall. Again, it allows for movement, but it suspends the colon from the posterior body wall. It can store fat as well. All of these membranes can potentially store fat. If you gain weight, typically what happens is you gain the weight first under your skin, so subcutaneous fat. As you gain more weight, you start to store fat inside the abdominal cavity, and it's stored within these membranes. It also tends to be stored around the kidneys, all throughout the abdominal cavity, and that interior fat is more harmful, potentially. It's also harder to get rid of. And people that have a severe weight issue have basically stored a lot of fat in these membranes, and it's encasing most of the organs found within the abdominopelvic region. Here we've got a nice simple schematic of how these membranes work. So the diagram towards the left shows a section through the lower abdomen. And in the middle, we've got a piece of the intestine here. Again, we're trying to keep things really simple. The outside of the intestine is visceral peritoneum. The inside lining of the cavity is parietal peritoneum. And again, they're continuous with each other. And then we have the mesentery that supports the small intestine, and it attaches to the posterior wall of the cavity. And the mesocolon does the same thing. It supports the colon. The second section on the right is a bit higher up and includes the liver. So what you're seeing here is, once again, we have the mesentery that's supporting the intestine to the back of the cavity. And then we have the lesser omentum, which connects the intestine, the duodenum, for instance, and the stomach to the liver. And then we have the falciform ligament, which connects to the anterior wall. And again, that's the only supporting membrane that connects to the anterior wall. So it's a bit unusual that way. But the liver is quite heavy, and also we have all this other stuff that's hanging off of it, so it needs some extra support. Now, you might be surprised to learn that some of the organs you thought were in the abdominopelvic cavity technically aren't. They're actually behind it. And we say that they're retroperitoneal. Retro means back or behind. If you're listening to retro music, you're going back in time, basically. So something that's retroperitoneal is behind, so dorsal to the peritoneum at the back of the abdominopelvic cavity. So the kidneys, for instance, are not technically in the pelvic or abdominopelvic cavity. They're just behind it because there's a layer of peritoneum over top of them. So they're completely separated by a layer of peritoneum. The ureters, the adrenal glands, these are all behind the peritoneal cavity. Parts of the circulation, so the aorta, the inferior vena cava, they're technically behind the abdominopelvic cavity. And parts of the digestive system, so the esophagus, the part that goes through the thorax, is retroperitoneal, and the upper part of the rectum is retroperitoneal as well. So if you're dissecting a pig, you'll notice that if you're dissecting out those parts, there's very, very thick membrane over top of them. Primary retroperitoneal means that the organ was outside of the abdominopelvic cavity through all of its development. Secondary or secondarily retroperitoneal refers to organs that start out in the body cavity but then move out of it as they develop. So the pancreas actually moves out of the cavity, just barely. I mean, it looks like it's in the cavity, but it has a layer, a continuous layer of peritoneum over top of it, and it doesn't surround the organ. There's just one layer that pushes it out, blocks it out from being in the abdominopelvic cavity. The duodenum, part of it, is retroperitoneal, and the colon, part of that is retroperitoneal. But these three organs, the pancreas, the duodenum, and the colon, start out within the abdominopelvic cavity, and then they move out of it as they develop. So a nice little schematic of that. So here we have a part of the alimentary canal that is retroperitoneal. And again, that means it's behind the peritoneum. So things like the pancreas, for instance, develop in this way. In the embryo, they are inside the cavity and they get pushed out of the cavity. So that's what you're seeing right here. So we see the duodenum here, and we see the pancreas attached to that. And then this gets pushed back and gets covered over by a layer of parietal peritoneum. and it's basically excluded from the cavity. So that's the pancreas and the part of the duodenum that the pancreas attaches to. So we're going to switch gears a bit and take a look at the function of the different regions of the digestive system, and then take a look at the histology and some of the smaller structures and work out how the form fits the function for these different parts. So we start with ingestion, which of course is taking in food and water. We have mechanical digestion occurring within the mouth. So when you're chewing your food, you're mechanically breaking it up. You're breaking it up into smaller particles. So you can swallow it, but also so that there's a larger surface area for acids and enzymes to work on. The food is going to enter the esophagus. You swallow it, it goes into the stomach. And once it's in the stomach will churn to mix the contents. Within the stomach, we have very strong acids. So there's hydrochloric acid. The pH of the stomach is less than 2. That's more acidic than battery acid. And what the acid does is it causes proteins to denature or unravel. And once the proteins are unraveled, then enzymes can get to the bonds between amino acids and break them so that we can break things down. The material from the stomach is dumped into the duodenum, the first part of the intestine. And we have a whole lot of enzymes and buffers and other things that are contributed at the duodenum by the pancreas. Most of the absorption of nutrients occurs in the small intestine, and that makes up most of the length of your digestive system. Whatever's left is going to make its way to the colon, and we don't have a whole lot of digestion going on here, at least not digestion that's mediated by the body. Instead, you have lots of bacteria living in the colon, and they continue to break things down. So we do get a little bit more nutrition from the colon due to the activity of bacteria. They also release things like vitamin K and other things that are important for us. But the primary goal of the large intestine is to absorb the remaining water so that that debris can be formed into feces. So let's start at the beginning, at the mouth, and work our way through the entire digestive system and just look at things in a bit more detail. The interior of the mouth is known as the buccal cavity or oral cavity. The top, the roof of the mouth, is formed by the hard palate, which is supported by bone, and then the soft palate. The soft palate is fleshy, and you have that weird little punching bag-like thing that hangs down from the soft palate. That's the uvula. And the uvula does serve a function. It's rather important in gagging reflexes. The tongue takes up a lot of space in the mouth, and it serves a few functions. Of course, we can use it to form sounds and words, but it's also really important when it comes to forming what's called a bolus of food. So as you're getting ready to swallow, what happens is the tongue comes up, presses the food against the roof of the mouth and pushes it backwards and forms it into kind of a slug that can slide down the esophagus. Now note that the esophagus is in the back behind the trachea. The trachea is lined by cartilage, and it's a tube that's always kept open, whereas the esophagus is usually collapsed and it's a soft tube. A couple things you might not be familiar with here. We have the hyoid bone. That's this bit right here. And there's ligaments that come off the hyoid bone that attach to the larynx, the cartilages of the larynx that are shown in blue. And the epiglottis is also supported by this system of hyoid bones. The gum and the tongue are keratinized slightly. They're not as keratinized as your skin, but they are a little tougher than the epithelial cells that you find throughout most of the digestive system. And that's because there's a lot of friction going on inside your mouth. You're also constantly shedding those cells. Your teeth are constantly grinding some of the skin off or some of the tissue off the inside of your mouth, and you're shedding those cells and replacing them. They grow quite quickly. On the left-hand side here, you're seeing the process of a bolus or ball of food being formed. So the tongue is going to push the food up against the palate and then squeeze it down the back and towards the esophagus. Notice that the epiglottis in this diagram is up As the bolus moves backwards, the epiglottis will fold over. It's like a little flap, and it folds down and it closes off the glottis. The glottis is the opening to the trachea, the windpipe. So don't get epiglottis and glottis mixed up. Glottis is an opening, it's a hole. The epiglottis is a flap. The food will make its way to the esophagus, and note that there is a sphincter at the top of the esophagus. That upper esophageal sphincter is one that you have control over. So you can control your swallowing, you can swallow when you want to, and that's one of the muscles that you have to control. There's a lower esophageal sphincter that we'll see in a second that is at the point where the esophagus meets the stomach. You don't have any control over that one. On the right, you can see the top surface, the superior surface of the tongue, and you can see the position of some of the taste buds. What I find kind of interesting is the taste buds actually extend back into your pharynx and even extend down onto the epiglottis. So the epiglottis does have some taste buds on it, mainly taste buds for umami flavors, so kind of meaty sort of flavors. The pharynx or throat can be divided into three regions. We have the nasopharynx, which is where the passages in the nose, the nasal cavities, connect up to the rest of the pharynx. We have the oropharynx, which is directly behind the mouth, so it is in direct contact with the buccal cavity or oral cavity. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is immediately posterior to the glottis. The laryngopharynx is where we have the separation of food and air occurring. So food and fluids are going to go down the esophagus, and air, of course, is going to go down the trachea. The esophagus moves food by peristalsis down into the stomach. Once the food gets past that upper pharyngeal sphincter, you don't have control of that process anymore. And as you probably know, you can eat standing on your head because it's not gravity that's causing the food to go down, although fluid will move under the influence of gravity, but it's mainly that peristalsis that's pushing material down towards the stomach. Now, the esophagus does not have a serous membrane. At least most of it doesn't. And the reason for that is that it's embedded in other tissues, so it's not in a cavity. Just like the other parts of the digestive system we've talked about, there's a mucosa, there's a submucosa, and there's a rather thick muscularis externa layer, which contains muscle fibers that are arranged in a circular orientation and a longitudinal orientation. And we need these thick muscles to squeeze food down the tube. Now, the tube is usually closed, unlike the trachea. The trachea is always open, but the esophagus is usually closed unless something is being squeezed down it. Instead of a serous membrane, we have what's called adventitia, which is fibrous, loose connective tissue that connects the esophagus to surrounding muscle and other connective tissues. Let's have a look at the process of swallowing, or deglutition if you want to be really fancy. We have a bolus of food that's being formed by the tongue. The tongue is pushing the food against the hard and soft palate. This is called the buccal phase. Buccal refers to the mouth, and this is voluntary. Once the food gets lower, you're going to have involuntary responses taking over. And again, by the time it gets past the upper esophageal sphincter, you don't have any more control. So the food has moved down past the epiglottis. You can see that the epiglottis has folded over so that food does not get into the trachea. And this, of course, is why you shouldn't talk when you're eating. So if you talk when you're eating, what's happening is you are expelling air, and that is holding the epiglottis open, and then food can get down into the trachea. And you're going to potentially choke if it gets lodged there. If it doesn't, you still might suffer pneumonia or some sort of infection because of the food getting down into your lungs. During this process, the upper esophageal sphincter is going to relax. That allows food to enter the esophagus. And as I mentioned, although you have control over the initiation of swallowing, once it begins, you really can't stop it. There's so many things going on, and basically you just start the process going. The bolus is going to move past the esophageal sphincter and it's going to close. The bolus is going to move down through the esophagus to the stomach. And what's happening here is peristalsis. So we have muscle fibers that are circular that go across this way. And then we have longitudinal muscle fibers that run this way. So what's happening is those circular rings of muscle basically are contracting and squeezing the tube just like you'd squeeze a tube of toothpaste. And at the same time, the longitudinal fibers are contracting and pushing things forward. As I mentioned, vomiting is essentially the same thing, the same process, but in reverse. So just a closer view of that, you can see that the esophagus is being pinched by circular fibers contracting, and at the same time the longitudinal muscles are contracting. So we're squeezing the back end of the bolus and causing it to move forward. Food will eventually make its way to the gastroesophageal sphincter, also called the lower esophageal sphincter. That's one that you don't have control over, but that is going to open to allow food to actually enter the stomach. The stomach has a very distinctive shape. So the little hump at the top that sticks up is called the fundus. The other end, where the stomach connects to the duodenum, is known as the pylorus. And the pylorus contains the pyloric sphincter. So the pyloric sphincter is the point where the pylorus attaches to the duodenum, and there's a ring of muscle there that controls the movement of material out of the stomach. The region between the pylorus and the fundus is known as the body. So that's the body of the stomach. And also note right up at the top where the esophagus enters, there's a region there known as the cardia. Another thing to note is that we have a thick muscularis layer. We have muscle fibers that run in three orientations. We have a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. And because we have these muscle cells arranged in different orientations, the stomach can be squeezed every which way, which helps the stomach churn material. Also notice on the inside of the stomach we have these folds called rugae. The folds increase surface area, which does aid with digestion a bit, but also the folds allow the stomach to expand. So if you eat a very large meal, those wrinkles will kind of stretch out and allow your stomach to accommodate that volume. Let's have a look at the histology of the stomach. So we have these pits called gastric pits. And at the bottom of these pits, we've got some specialized cells that produce hydrochloric acid, produce enzymes, and a few other things. Most of the cells lining the stomach, though, are unspecialized. Below the mucosa, we've got, again, a submucosa. And note that between the submucosa and the mucosa, there is a muscularis mucosae, a very thin layer of involuntary muscle. Again, this doesn't cause peristalsis. It just helps those pits kind of wave around a little bit so that things get mixed nicely. Underneath that, we have a very thick muscularis layer. Again, we've got these muscle fibers that are oriented in different directions so that the stomach can churn the material inside it. Let's have a look at those specialized cells. So we have lots of mucus cells. We have them on the surface and also in the neck of these pits. The mucus helps protect the lining of the stomach from the really strong acid that's found in the lumen of the stomach. We have parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. We have chief cells that secrete something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is the precursor of an enzyme. Once it's released from the cells and finds its way into the lumen of the stomach, it becomes pepsin, which is a really powerful enzyme that's very, very good at breaking down big proteins into smaller pieces. Also, we have lipase that's produced. and the lipase will help break down fats. We also have cells called G cells that produce gastrin, and gastrin is a hormone that stimulates the rest of the digestive system, the intestines, to get ready and prepare for food. So within the stomach, we have powerful peristaltic waves. So this is mixing the food in with the enzymes and the hydrochloric acid and buffers and other things. This mixture is known as chyme, and this chyme is going to be released in small amounts into the duodenum. So it's not released all at once, it's released as little packets. On to the small intestine. So the first part of the small intestine is the duodenum, and this is where the pancreas empties its contents. And then after that, we have the jejunum. After that, we have the ileum. So these are all regions of the small intestine. And then after that, the food is going to proceed into the colon. Of course, it's no longer food at that point. The small intestine is where most of the nutritive absorption occurs. There's a huge surface area on the inside of the small intestine. So there's folds, and then on top of the folds, we have these little projections called villi that greatly increase the surface area over which material can be absorbed. The cells that make up the epithelium of the villi have their own tiny little projections that are called microvilli. But you can see once again, we've got all the same layers that we talked about before. And once again, that muscularis mucosae, that really thin layer of muscle, just causes the villi to kind of wave back and forth a bit. Whereas the lower layer of muscle, the muscularis proper, causes peristalsis and movement of material through the intestine. Note that we've got a really good blood supply to the villi, and we've also got lymphatic vessels, which are shown in green, that are part of the immune system. So we've got folds. On top of the folds, we've got villi, and then the cells that make up the epithelium have microvilli, which is shown in part D here. So figure D is through an electron microscope looking at those microvilli. Now also note that in between the cells, where I'm drawing this red line here, there are tight junctions, and the tight junctions are basically seals that prevent material from seeping between the cells. So any material that gets in has to go through the cell. It can't go between the cell. And that means that the cell can decide what gets on to the connective tissue and into the blood vessels and lymph vessels. So this is just a slide. We're looking at a section of the intestine with a light microscope. You can see the villi there. You can see the different layers we've talked about. The serosa, of course, is on the outside of the intestine. So to the far left would be the body cavity, the abdominal cavity. The crypts, we're not going to talk too much about those just yet, but these are basically little pockets, little sacs that will trap bacteria so that the bacteria can be dealt with by the immune system. There are specialized cells within the intestine as well, although most of the cells are just involved in absorption. But the absorptive cells with the microvilli, they also do produce and secrete some enzymes. The enzymes are active in the spaces between the microvilli. So those enzymes work right at the surface of the cell. We have goblet cells, which are individual cells that are quite large. They're very noticeable on slides. You'll see them in the lab. And they are going to produce mucus, which will help protect the mucosal layer and also keep things moving, keep things nice and slippery. We have Paneth cells that produce lysozyme, and lysozyme is an enzyme that will break down peptidoglycan, which is found in the cell walls of bacteria. So that's to discourage bacteria cells from burrowing into the mucosa. And we have enteroendocrine cells that will produce hormones that regulate the gastrointestinal activity. And these other structures I think we've talked about already. So here again, you can see those different cell types. We have absorptive cells with microvilli that increase their surface area, because the only area that's exposed to the lumen is the top of the cell, the apex of the cell. We have goblet cells that produce mucus, we have enteroendocrine cells, and we have these Paneth cells. So looking at the surface of the intestine, we have these circular folds. Again, these will increase the surface area. They also kind of impede and slow the flow of material. We don't want material to go through the digestive system too quickly. There needs to be enough time for it to be broken down. And then, of course, on top of these folds, we have villi. So compare the folds in the intestine to the folds in the stomach. They are a bit different. First of all, the folds in the stomach are non-permanent. And what I mean by that is when the stomach fills with food, these folds kind of stretch out. So the stomach becomes less wrinkly inside. The reason for this is that the stomach is kind of a holding area for a meal, because we're not eating constantly, so we have to store a meal, and then the stomach releases a little bit at a time into the intestines. So the intestines don't have to expand very much. Their volume doesn't change a whole lot. And the folds in the intestine are permanent. They don't change a whole lot as material moves through them. And once again, I can't stress enough how much surface area there is on the inside of the small intestine. Movement of food through the intestine is not entirely in one direction. The food does move back and forth a bit, and that's to help it mix. So what you're seeing here is something called segmentation. So in the first diagram, we can see that we have these segments of partially digested food. They're shown different colors so you can see what's going on. And what happens is this constriction here is going to open up and allow these two packets of material to mix together, and that's what we see over here. That is mixed by movements of the intestine, and then segmentation occurs again. So we constantly have the intestine being kind of squeezed into these little segments. The rings of muscle relax and allow the contents of those segments to mix together, and then everything is segmented again. So this ensures very, very thorough mixing. Here's a high magnification shot with a light microscope that shows the microvilli at the tops of the epithelial cells that are found on the villi. And you can see this with the microscopes we have at the college, so hopefully you'll be able to see this. You'll have to use oil immersion and magnify it about 1,000 times, but you should see what's called the brush border. And the brush border is made up of these tiny little microvilli. Enzymes that are secreted by the epithelial cells are basically trapped in that brush border. And some of the digestion, the last stages of digestion before stuff moves into the cells, occurs in this brush border. So at this point, we have proteins that are broken down into very tiny fragments. So they might consist of just 2 or 3 amino acids. Within the brush border, they're broken down into individual amino acids that can be taken up more easily by the cell. So this is the last step of digestion, as I mentioned, before absorption occurs. After food passes through the small intestine, it passes into the large intestine. The ileum is the last portion of the small intestine, and it's connected to the large intestine through something known as the ileocecal sphincter or valve. So there's a ring of muscle here, involuntary muscle, that controls the movement of material between the small intestine and large intestine. So food is going to come this way, through that valve, and then up this way. Now below that valve, there is this blind sac. And I call it a blind sac because it's open at the top, but it doesn't go anywhere. Food does make its way into this cecum, this pouch, and it kind of swills around in there. And some of it goes into the lumen of the appendix as well. Technically, properly, the appendix is known as the vermiform appendix. Vermi means worm, form means the shape of, it literally means worm-like appendix. So the appendix isn't entirely without function. There are lots of diverse species of bacteria that live within the appendix, and it's thought that having a healthy population of these bacteria in the appendix, which is closely associated with the lymphatic system, might help boost your immune response. But you can, of course, get by without an appendix. It does occasionally become infected and inflamed. The large intestine, as you can see, consists of these pouches known as haustra. And these pouches help impede the movement of materials, so there's more time to absorb water. That's the main function of the colon. A lot of water absorption, in fact more water absorption, occurs in the small intestine, but the last bits of water that can be extracted will be extracted in the colon to form solid feces. If you've got diarrhea, it's because you're not reabsorbing that water. And in many parts of the world where diarrheal diseases are common, very, very rapid dehydration can be fatal in cases of bad diarrhea. So the colon has these three very obvious parts to it. It's got an ascending section, it's got a transverse going across in the transverse plane, it's got a descending section, and then the last little bit is the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid means S-shaped, so it's kind of an S-shaped bend. And then the last bit there is the rectum before we get to the anus. Finally, we have the anus itself. So we have the rectum leading up to the body wall, and then we have the anus, which is the actual opening, and the anal canal, which is the area between the rectum and the anus. And notice on this diagram there are two sphincters. You have an internal anal sphincter. You don't have control over that. Normally your body is keeping that closed for you, and you don't have to think about it, which is nice, because otherwise fluid and such would leak out. And then you've got an external anal sphincter, which is voluntary. And as I mentioned before, if you really need the bathroom bad, what's happened is the internal sphincter is opened. Your body is saying, get rid of this now. And your external sphincter is the one you're using to hold things in. So the large intestine, we don't have as many specialized cells. We do have absorption occurring here, but it's mainly absorption of water. We do have lots of goblet cells, though, that are producing mucus to keep things lubricated. And that's quite important in the colon because, of course, if the feces are fairly dry, they're not going to move unless the inside of the colon is nice and slippery. It also protects the cells within the colon from the effects of frictional forces as you are defecating. We do have some absorption of nutrients, but it's not very much. As I mentioned before, bacteria that live in the colon can break down some food that you weren't able to absorb, so we do get a little bit more nutrition from the efforts of those bacteria. So the cells we have absorptive cells that are absorbing water, and we have these goblet cells that produce mucus. So the large intestine also undergoes peristalsis, and the peristalsis occurs very slowly. Movement through the colon is pretty slow. We have what's called haustral churning, so each one of those little sacs can fill up, and there's stretch receptors that are activated, and then the sac contracts. Again, this is involuntary, using smooth muscle, and that allows for increased mixing again. Then we have mass peristalsis, which is what occurs during defecation. So we have this massive push. Basically, the entire colon is going to push in a concerted effort to pass feces. And here we have our terminology list. So again, of course, I will only ask you things that I've discussed in the PowerPoint, so use the terminology as a guide for what you need to know.